Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Lee Halliday, and in this video we are going to be using Firebase's real-time database to create an X's and O's game, otherwise known as tic-tac-toe, and this is the final app that we're going to be building. It's inside of Next.js, but that's sort of not that important. We just wanted to build a React app somewhere, and in here on the first page we can enter in the players. So we're going to say this is Lee versus the world. And when you click Let's Play, it gives you a URL that you can then paste and share to your friend. So over here, I'm going to be my friend. And we can go for Lee's turn. So on my friend's computer over here, it's now their turn. So we'll do O, then we'll do X, we'll do O here, and X. And there we go. Lee is the champ. And at any time we can reset the board to play another game, and then it's the world's turn to start. So this is the final app that we're going to be building. So let's get started by going into the Firebase console and creating our new project and real-time database, etc. I have a commit that I'll link to below with the initial code if you want to follow along with me, and then I'll also commit at the end and share that link as well if you want to look at the final code in case you get stuck at any point in this video. Thanks a lot, and let's get going. So we're going to create our Firebase application, and that starts off in the Firebase console. So console.firebase.google.com, where we're going to click Add Project, and we'll need to give it a name. So we'll just call this X's and O's, and then we'll click Continue. No, we don't want Google Analytics for this one, and we'll just give it about 30 seconds for it to finish creating our project. Okay, the project's ready, so we're going to click Continue, and that's going to drop us in here on the dashboard. And we're going to set up two things, even though for now we really only need one. We're going to set up auth and real-time database. And we'll start with real-time database. So we'll click into this, and it's going to ask us, is real-time database right for you? Yes, it is. So click Create, and we'll host this in the US. Security rules. So by default, if you don't set up any rules, basically the entire internet has free reign over your data. So you would want to lock it maybe to a specific person or to some people can read but not write. We're going to start in test mode, which does open it up to everyone for a certain period of time. I think 30 days. And in another video, so not in this one, but in another one, we're going to go over this in a bit more detail and add in authentication with Firebase Auth. I always think it should be called Firebase, but anyways, enable this, set up our database. It's going to drop us in here, and this is a null database, so there's no value at all right now. So rules is where you can go and edit your rules and figure out sort of who should have read and write to what parts of your data. But that's for another time. So the next thing we're going to set up is authentication, not because we need it right now, but just because it's going to give us this API key that we'll use in another video. And this only takes a second. So we are going to enable email and password auth, so just click that. Done, that's all. So clicking over here into project settings, we need two things. We need our project ID and our web API key. So we're just going to copy this and we're going to go over into code. So let me close everything. I'm doing this inside of Next.js just because it gives me routing and stuff like that really easily. But this isn't really a Next.js tutorial, although we'll learn a few things in the process. But I'm going to go into my .env.local file where I'm going to be storing my those two values locally in environment variables. So the project ID is pasted in, and then we'll come back and we'll grab the API key. Both of these can be public, so that's why we've given them the next public Firebase API key and project ID. So we're going to start here on the home page, and what our home page is going to do, if we start up our app, is going to give us that form where we can enter in the two players' names that are going to participate in X's and O's. And the purpose of this page, this home right here, is to show us a form, but when we submit that, it's going to essentially create a new game in our database. Then we'll redirect the user to the game page where we'll have all of the game functionality. So this is what we've got going on right now. Now, in order to work with Firebase, you have to initialize it. So we're going to uncomment this import Firebase from src init Firebase. So we're going to hop on over to this file where I've already set up a few things just to avoid some typing, but I'll explain what it does. So we're going to import Firebase from Firebase app, and then we have to import Firebase auth. We don't actually need to for this video because we're not doing auth, but for future, if you want auth, you would want this. And we've got import Firebase database, which will give us this Firebase database functionality. Okay, config. Here's the config to both configure auth and Firebase. So if you don't want auth, just delete these first two, but I believe you still need the next two. So first is the API key, and we're just reading straight from our environment variable. Next is the auth domain, and what it is, it's basically the project id.firebaseapp.com. Next is we have to point it towards our database. Where does this exist? And if you're ever wondering where you get this big long URL from, where the project ID is embedded in it, you get that by clicking on your real-time database, and it's got this right here. So HTTPS, you got your project ID, default, realtimedatabase.firebaseio.com. So that's where that came from. And then lastly, we just have the project ID, which is down here at the bottom. So what we're going to do is create a function called init Firebase. This is going to do the work of actually initializing Firebase. And Firebase, this code may run multiple times, but we only want to initialize it once. So the way you do that is you can basically check how many apps this Firebase that you imported contains. So what we're going to do is we're going to say when there's not a length. So firebase.apps.length. So if there's not a length, we're going to go initialize it. So firebase.initialize app, and we'll pass in our config here. We're going to call it, so anytime somebody imports this code, it's just going to come pre-initialized init Firebase like that. And we are going to export Firebase. That way, when we go back here and we've imported Firebase, everything's already initialized, we're good to go, and we can start working with it. So inside of main, we're going to build a form. So we'll start with form, and in here we're going to add 2 inputs to collect the player names, and then a button which will submit the form and allow us to create a new game inside of our database. So we'll start with our first input. So it's a name of player 1. It's going to have a value, and then set value. It's going to call a function. So we're missing a few things. Where are these values? And sorry, it's not set value, it's on change. When this event happens, we want to set the value. So we don't have a value set up yet. So that's why we're going to pop up here, and we're going to use the useState hook to define a new state, a new piece of state. So const player1 and set player1 is equal to useState, and we'll give it an initial value of player1, just like that, to keep it simple. And since we're here, let's also set up player2. useState player2 as the initial value. So now we can come back down to our form, and we can say the value for this input is player1, and on change we are going to get an event, and we're going to call set player1 with the event, the e.target.value, just like that. So save it, pretties things up, and we're going to copy this to get player2. So just change this to player2, and player2. So if we were to look at our form now, we've got these 2 inputs. You know what's missing though? A nice H1. So this will say X's and O's. Beauty. Okay, so down below we're going to create a button of type submit, and it's going to say like, let's play, something like that. And what's going to happen when you click this button, it will submit the form. So we're going to go up here to the form and listen for the onSubmit event, which will give us the event, and we'll just prevent default because we're going to handle everything ourselves. So this is about the time we actually need access to our Firebase database. So why don't we set that up now? And I am going to come up here outside of this home component function, and I'm just going to put into a variable db, and it's going to be equal to firebase.database, like this. So this is a ref to our Firebase database. Now, we can come back here inside of here, and the way Firebase works is you sort of get a reference to a portion of the database, and we're going to reference something that doesn't exist yet. So we're going to say, give us a reference to the games. So if this were like Postgres, you would almost think of it as a games table. So some table where you're going to put all of the games inside. Firebase doesn't really work like that because it's like this big gigantic JSON object, but maybe you'll see what it looks like in a second. So we're going to access our DB, and we're going to get a ref to games. So think of it like you're accessing the games table. And we want to push a new game into this table. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a ref to a new game ref, and we're going to access the games ref, so this one up here, and push a new one into it. So this almost represents like a new record in your database table if you were thinking in terms of relational databases. And with this sort of empty record, you can set a bunch of data inside of it. So what we're going to say is new game ref, and we're going to set the data. So what data are we going to set in here? The data that we're going to track per game is the name of player 1. So we can just put in player 1 like this, the name of player 2, and we're going to keep track of whose turn it is. So every turn, so like player 1 clicks a button, adds an X, it goes over to player 2's turn, and it flip-flops back and forth. So we're going to start this by saying it's player 1's turn. And we're also going to keep track of who had the first turn. So in the very first game, it's going to be player 1 that starts, and that will let us know that player 1 is equal to X, so then player 2 would be equal to O. So first will also be player 1. And now we're going to create our board. So this represents that 3x3 X's and O's game. So we're going to say board. It's going to be an array of arrays where each sort of first level array represents a row, and then each value in here represents a column. So here we're going to just set empty values because nobody's gone yet. So we'll put in 1, 2, 3 rows of 3. Okay, so if this works correctly, it's going to have inserted a new game into our database under the games path. But now we want to redirect the user to a page that has the ID of the game in the URL. So in order to do that redirecting, we first need to get access to the Next.js router. So we're going to come here and we're going to say const router is use router, which was imported up here at the top. And with the router, we can push the user to a new page, a new route, and it's going to be /games and then the dynamic ID that was just inserted into the database. And the way you access that is by saying new game ref dot key. So dot key is the unique reference. It's the ID basically for that game. So we're going to do that, and we'll submit it and sort of see what happens and follow and hunt all that down. So we're going to come here. We'll say that player 1 is just called player 1, player 2. Let's play. Super fast. It worked right away. And you can see that it redirected us to games and then / this thing here. So this thing here represents the ID of the game we just inserted into the database. And if you were to come back here, you can see that our database is no longer null. We now have games as one path. And inside of games, we have one, I still call them records because I happen to think in terms of relational databases, but one sort of entry here into the games object. And you can see MSAN, that is equal to the one that's up here. So here's all of our data. The first move is by player 1. Here are the names of player 1 and 2. And whose turn it is player 1. We could open up the board and we could see the values on the board. Cool. So once we come here, now we have to build the game board and add in all of that functionality to make this work. And the first thing we're going to do is get access to this ID using getServerSideProps function that comes with Next.js to be able to then go to Firebase and load this game from the database and to listen to real-time updates that the database is telling us about. Because the goal of this is essentially we're player 1, we would copy and paste this to our buddy, and our buddy would open it up in their browser and they would see the game as well, and we'd both be sort of watching real time what each other are doing. So we're going to pop over into the component that represents this page we're on. So in our code, that lives under /games and then /. It's named with square brackets to represent a dynamic portion. Basically the ID is what this will be here, which could be any value. And the first thing we want to do is basically find a way to get this ID into our game component. And there's a couple ways of doing it. The first way is by using the router to give us access to the ID that it sees in the query params up here. But I'm going to do it using a function called getServerSideProps. And the reason is, maybe I'll just show you quickly, even though I wasn't planning on this. So we will import use router from next router. So you don't have to type this because we're going to delete it in a second. But if we were to come in here and say const router is use router, and then we're going to get access to the ID. So ID is equal to router.query.id, and then we'll console.log the ID. Why don't we even just console.log the router.query? Let's just do the entire thing. So I'm going to save this, come back here, go into my tools, clear everything out, and refresh. And what you're going to notice is that it actually gets rendered one time with no value, and then a second time with the actual ID in here. And this is consistent. Every time you refresh it, empty and then value. And the reason is because right now it's sort of statically generating this page. So it's going to render once and it doesn't have the context of what page it's being rendered in with this here. And then the router sort of picks up, okay, I'm running on this page. I'm going to re-render and give you the query. But that means we have to handle like one render without an ID, one render with. So we're going to get rid of this. And instead, we are going to use the function getServerSideProps. So we're going to export const getServerSideProps. And the type for this is getServerSideProps. And it's going to be equal to an async function that will receive the query. So that's the same information that was coming from the router. So in here, it's our job to basically return the initial props that this page is going to receive. So the props it's going to receive are the ID, which comes from query.id. So this runs on the server, and it will run prior to this component being rendered at all. And when this is rendered, it's going to receive the ID as a prop. So why don't we just add some types in for this? We could define an interface of iProps, which will receive an ID as a string. So this is iProps, just like this. And so now if we were to come and render the ID on the screen, it's always going to be there immediately, which is good because now we don't have to worry about that. Anyways, that was a long time to explain just how to get the ID. So let's move on. So the first thing we're going to do is basically listen for real-time updates from our database for the path slash or games slash this ID that we have now. And we're going to do that inside of a useEffect hook. So we're going to come here and we're going to say useEffect, and we only want it to run once on the initial load. So we'll just put an empty dependency array here. And the first thing we need is access to our database. So we don't have it, so let's come up here, import Firebase just like we did on the home page, and we'll say const db equals to firebase.database, like that. So with our DB, we need a ref. So same sort of thing, Firebase always works in refs. You're sort of pointing to one place in the database. It's not really like a ref as you think of in React. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a ref to the path, which is games slash the ID. So I suppose our one dependency could be the ID, because technically you should if you're referencing that here. So just like this, and what we're going to do is we're going to listen for changes anytime it changes, and that is on. And we want the value when it changes, and this gives us a function. And the function receives something called a snapshot. And from the snapshot, we can get the value of our database. So if we were to console.log snapshot.val, we'll just see what it looks like. But I want to first return a cleanup function from useEffect. This would run when the page is unmounted. So when the page is unmounted, we are going to say ref.off to basically tell it, hey, you can stop listening now. So why don't we go load our page? And right here, you can see that we are looking at the value of this record or this ref, this entry in our database, where we have the board, which is an array of arrays, and then we have all of our player information. So what are we going to do with that? I want to put it into state. So we're going to come up here, we're going to say, I want some state called game, and then set game. And it is going to be equal to use state, and it will start off as null. And because we're working in TypeScript, I want to declare an interface called iGame, or null, because when it's initialized, it doesn't exist. So let's come and create this interface. So interface iGame, game, and we just have to describe what a game looks like. So our game looks like player 1 is a string, player 2 is a string, first is a string, whose turn it is a string, and now we have the board ourselves. And what is a board? It's made up of 3 rows. So what we're going to do is say I row, oh boy, I row. And that doesn't exist, so we're just going to come up above here, and we're going to say type iRow is equal to an array with 3 entries, where all the 3 entries are strings. So here we've sort of represented array of 3 rows, where each row looks like string, string, string. Space that out a little bit. So now we know what a game looks like. So we can come here, and instead of console.logging it, we can call setGame. Perfect. And if we were to maybe just for a second place a pre in here and json.stringify our game, null and spacing of 2, we should see the game on our page. Perfect. So here it is. We have our board and then our player info here. So with that in place, I first just want to check when there's no game, because useEffect happens after a render. So what we're going to do is say if there's no game, return a div that says loading, or loading game, or something like that. So once we get to this point, we know that game is an iGame. So that gives us a certain set of assurance that there's a value in here. So what we're going to start is by essentially rendering the board. So I'm going to create a div, and in this div, I need to iterate over each of the rows of our board. So we're going to come in here and we're going to say game.board, and we're going to iterate over, so map, and each one of those will be a row. And we do want our row index because we're going to use that as our key. And normally using indexes as a key is a no-no, but here it sort of is the key. You have row 1, 2, or 3, and there's no sort of value in here that would tell us that. So each row is going to be another div, and we need to give it a key. So our key here, if we wanted to, we could say row and then row index, like that. And our value for now, why don't we just say row index to make sure that it's working correctly. So there we go, row 0, 1, and 2, or 1, 2, and 3. Come back here. Okay, so in each row we have to iterate over the 3 columns that are there. So we're going to get rid of this row index that's showing up. And in here we are going to say row.map, and what we're mapping here is the columns. So call, and we'll access the call index like this. And it's going to also just output a div. So let's save this to get some formatting. We have to come and add a key. So our key here, I'm going to put basically row index dash embed that call index. So that would be like 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, etc. And our value here, this is just going to be the call. So save this. And the problem right now, it's sort of not showing up as anything. So I set up a few classes in global here, board, row, and the square, just to get this showing up. So we're going to add that class. So this is the board. This one would be the row, so class name of row. And this one here would be a class name of square. Perfect. So there is our game board. And next thing up, we need to handle the clicks. So when you click on a square, it shows up X or O. But maybe even before we do that, why don't we get an H1 showing up that just says which player's turn it is. So what we're going to do here, we are going to say if the game.turn is equal to player 1, then we are going to show game.player1. Otherwise, we'll show player 2, and it's their turn. So we come here, player 1's turn, and then down here we have the board, and we'll have to register a click on these squares and record an X or an O depending on who is clicking. So that's what we're going to do now, and we're going to do this by adding an on-click event to the div here. Probably we should make this a button, but that's going to throw off all my styling, so let's just keep it as a div. So in here we have this. Okay, so when do I want to allow a click? I want to allow a click only when the column is empty, basically when there's no value in this square. Because if there is a value, it means it's already occupied by an X or an O. So when the call is equal to an empty string, that's when we're going to allow this. And we're going to call a function called saveMove. And this doesn't exist yet, so we'll have to go and create it. But what we're going to do is we're going to pass up the row index and the call index that our user is trying to click in. So why don't we go up here just below our use effect, and here we're going to define a function const saveMove that is going to take in the row index as a number and the call index also as a number. And it's an arrow function. So what this is going to do, its goal is basically to go and place an X or an O in the game board inside of our database. And we're going to start by basically taking a copy of state. So taking a copy of the game. So we're going to say const copy is equal to ... game. And then we're going to basically access the right piece on the board. So we're going to say copy.board, and then inside of board, we're going to access the row index and then the column index. And we need to set it to either an X or an O. So what we're going to do is we're going to say game, whose turn is it? So if the turn is equal to, so turn would be whose turn it is, so player 1 or player 2. If the turn is equal to the person who started the game, so first, and I'm putting these question marks here because it's saying that game might be null. So we could get rid of that by just saying if there's not a game, return. And now we don't have to put the question marks here because game always has a value. This should never happen because it only gets rendered down here, but TypeScript isn't smart enough in this case. So what we're doing is we're saying if the person whose turn it is equal to the person that started the game, that's who an X is. The person who goes first is an X. So question mark X. Otherwise, it means it's not the first person, so we're going to put an O in there. Save that. And next we need to swap whose turn it is. So if it was player 1's, it's now player 2's, etc. And we do that by saying the turn is now equal to, so if the turn was player 1, that means it's now player 2. Otherwise, oops, this is a question mark. Otherwise, it's player 1. So we're just flip-flopping this value back and forth. So now that my copy has been updated, I need to go and place its value back inside of the database. So for that, I'm going to access our DB, the ref of the game. So that would be games and then / the ID. And what I want to do is set a value here. So very much like we did at the home page when we set the initial state of our game, we're going to come here and we're going to place in the copy that we just tweaked. And so that is going to trigger real-time like reacting, which will trigger this code running, which will update our state with the latest value from Firebase. So this is updating the state, but sort of going through the real-time database and it notifying about us. That way we're always having the database drive the state rather than us trying to keep them in sync. And it's fast enough that you don't really even notice in this case. So we're going to come here, we're going to click, see we recorded an X, now it's player 2's turn. So we could click here and record an O, X, O, X, O. So we have two problems. One, we have a winner here, and another, maybe we just want to reset and start the game again. So why don't we just handle the reset quickly? We'll add a button here to get us back to the initial state. So we're going to put this button here down below the board, and it's just a type button that says reset. And when you click it on click, we're just going to do this inline. What we're going to do is first take a copy of our game. So const copy is equal to game, and we want to reset everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to say the first person's move, we're going to flop this. So if player 1 started last game, now it's player 2's turn. So we're going to say if it was player 1, now we're going to make it player 2. Otherwise, it's back to player 1. Like this. We need to make whose turn it is equal to whoever gets the first move. And now we need to set our board back to the initial state. So I can actually just go back here and copy what an empty board looks like that. So now that the game is sort of has been reset, we can say the db.ref at game/id should be set back to copy. Cool. So we click this, and I messed up something. All right, what did I do? Oh, it's games. Oh, this will be interesting. Let's go see. I put in here the wrong data. So let's just delete that. Come back here and it's games/ID. Did I mess up the other one too? No, this one was right. Okay, let's try to reset this again. Come back here, click reset. There we go, and now it's player two's turn to start. So let's say I put a X in here. And the cool thing is you can see your data in real time. So we have an X here. O shows up. And obviously, since it's a real time, we could open up a new window, paste this here, and they'd be in sync. See how quick that shows up? So they're perfectly in sync. We can reset, and it's good to go. Okay, so now we have the ability to reset the board. Why don't we go and figure out when there's a winner? So we're not going to store who won in the database. We're just sort of going to use React to show that real time. It's fast enough. And what we're going to do is create a variable here called winner. And we want to check if there's a winner, when there's a game, so and. And then we're going to call a function, and this function is going to be called checkWinner. And it's going to pass the game up to this. And it's going to basically return us a Boolean of whether or not there's a winner. So why don't we go and we can just declare this here. And we're going to create a function called checkWinner. And it's going to return us a Boolean. Did I do this right? CheckWinner. Return us a Boolean. Is that right? Void. Okay, yeah. So if I were to return true, it's happy. Okay, I declared a function. Congratulations, Lee. All right, so in here we want to check if there's a winner. And this is just to help us visualize what the board looks like. There's an array of 3 things, so 3 strings, like this. And the first one is row 0, column 0. And then the next one's row 0, 1, 0, 2. So that's sort of what our index is like, or looked like for each one. So this one would be row 1. And this one would be row with an index of 2. So this is what our board looks like. And X's and O's, there's basically a winner if it's horizontal 3 in a row, vertical 3 in a row, and then 2 diagonals like this. So we're going to check each one. And we're going to do this by declaring sort of a few different functions. So the first function we're going to create is basically going to check if there's a winner by row. And we're going to just start by receiving the game, which is an iGame, and we're going to put the board into a variable, so game.board, just to make it a little bit less easier to access. So our first function that's going to check is by row. It's going to be an arrow function, and what we're going to do is iterate over each of the rows, so rows 0, 1, and 2, and we want to check if one of them is true, if one of them has a match. So for that we're going to use sum, and in here we're going to iterate where we're going to get I representing if it's row 0, 1, or 2. So what we want to first check is just to make sure if the board at row I column 0 is not equal to empty. That means that there is a value. So this run has a value. Then we're going to say board, the same square, check if it's equal to the 1 beside it. So 1. So let me just save that. And we want to check if I at 1, so this one is equal to the third one, is equal to board I at 2. Cool. So this is going to go over row 1, row 2, and then row 3, and it's going to check if there's a match in any of them. So we've handled checking this, this, this. Now we have to check on columns. So we're going to create another function called byCall, and it is going to do the same sort of thing where we're going to go over 0, 1, and 2. And we're going to check if one of them is true, so if sum, and we're going to use I here. So this time, the what we're going to do, so we're going to basically place the variable in the second one. So we're going to say if the board at row 1, column I is not empty, and if that value is equal to the row below, so this one here, so that would be 1 at I, and check that this one is equal to this one. So board at 2I is equal to, no, board at 1I is equal to 2 at I. All right, this is the most tedious code in the world. It may take you a little bit of time to go over this. I'm not even entirely sure that this code works, but we're going to see. So now we need to do the 2 diagonals. I'm just going to move this down below so it's easier to reference. Okay, diagonal 1. What we're going to do is check to make sure this has a value. So that would be board at 0, 0 is not equal to that. And we want to make sure that board at 0, 0 is equal to 1, 1. And we want to make sure that board at 1, 1 is equal to the board at 2, 2. Okay, so this function will tell us if this diagonal has a match. Now we need to check this diagonal. So const diag2 is equal to, let's start in the top right and work our way down. So the board at 0, 2 is not equal to empty, and 0, 2 is equal to 1, 1 in the center, 1, 1, and 1, 1 is equal to 2, 0. Cool, save that formatting. So we've written all of these functions to check if there's a winner, checking each row at a time. Then we wrote one to check each column at a time. Then we check diagonal 1 and diagonal 2. So we're going to return by row, check if there's a winner, or by call that, or diag 1, call that, or diag 2. So if it finds a winner on row 1, it doesn't need to check by row. It's basically only going to check the next one if the first one returns false. So now our winner has a Boolean or null, so why don't we just winner, Boolean or null, whatever, good to go. We could confirm that we could do this. Now it's always a Boolean. There we go. Okay, so this contains whether there's a winner or not. So why don't we do this? Here where we just showed whose turn it is, why don't we instead basically, there's 2 H1s, one when there's a winner and one when it's just someone's turn. So if there's a winner, we're going to show an H1. Otherwise, we'll show that H1 like this. Okay, so how do we know who won? Well, we have to look at whose turn it was before, so the previous player's turn, because that's who did the last move, so that's who the winner is. So what we're going to do is similar logic to this. We're going to say if the turn is player 1, well, that actually means player 2 has won. So player 2 Otherwise, it's player 1, like this, is the champ. Champ. Boom. So save that, and I just want to make one last tweak. We don't want to allow them to keep clicking if there's already a winner. So we want to say if the call is empty and there's not a winner. You can't keep playing when that's the case. The only thing you can do is reset the board and play again. So we're going to come back X, O, X. Boom! Player 1 is the champ. So we tested the diagonal. Let's test this one. Worked. Let's test row. Works. And let's test column. Sweet. So by row, by column, and the 2 diagonals all tell me who the winner is. So at this point, our X's and O's game is done. What we've done is we've gone from the ability to create a game. So Lee versus the world. So it's my turn, then the world, and the world won. But we can reset and play again, and now it's the world's turn to go. So what we've done here is we've basically started off by getting the ID, which came to us via the initial props returned from getServerSideProps. And using that inside of useEffect, we were listening for any value change to that game's reference in the database. And anytime we get that snapshot of the database, we're getting its val and putting it into state. So then we came down here and we drew our board, which sort of looks crazy now, but we were iterating over rows and columns. And then when you click the column, we save that move as long as there's not already a space there. So you can't click there again. You can only click an empty space. And when there's no winner. So saving a move basically takes a copy of our game, places in the X and the O, and then switches whose turn it is, and then updates that referenced value in the database. And every single time this re-renders, we're checking to see if there's a winner. So here was this sort of, this does nothing now. We can comment that out if we want. Here was this sort of crazy logic where we'd iterate over each row checking, each column checking, diagonal 1, diagonal 2, and we're sort of checking here the entire board to see if there's a winner. This gives us the Boolean, and using the Boolean, we can basically, if there's a winner, say that they are the champ. Hope you enjoyed this overview of working with Firebase's real-time database. We saw how to push new values in, how to listen to changes, how to update values. So I'm going to move on into some other videos after this where we add in Firebase auth and then we start adding in restrictions into our database so that we can see how that works because it's very important. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.